Good morning, everyone. My name is Angelica Paniagua, and I'm a student representative on the MLK Day Planning Committee. I sincerely welcome you all to Bates College's 35th Martin Luther King Jr. Day observance. This event took tireless planning from the MLK Day Committee, which is composed of Bates staff, students, and faculty, as well as the many community members offering Bates their knowledge and experience. Thank you, and thank you to the people in this chapel and beyond who choose to engage in this programming and the conversations surrounding them. Love and anger are both very powerful, heightened emotions. We exist in a world where both feelings constantly overwhelm us. We want to keep the intense love we have for our close ones, our love for the world that could be, for some, a world that once was, but we must also contend with the struggles that come when we are angry, when anger is directed towards us, and when anger becomes hatred, becomes noise that allows for injustice to exist. The Bates community felt these heightened emotions during the outbreak of the First Persian Gulf War in 1991. In response to so many lives lost amidst a severe lack of information, faculty voted to cancel classes on MLK Day, emphasizing Martin Luther King Jr.'s life dedication to world peace. In MLK's words, "History has taught it is not enough for people to be angry. The supreme task is to organize and unite people so that their anger becomes a transforming force." Although our conversations towards MLK's goals of peace, justice, and equality should not be limited to a single day, intentionally having this day on provides us with one opportunity to unite. When we leave our feelings of anger and love to fester all alone, leaving no conversation or interaction between them, we accept indifference and make no transformation. We hope that today you learn, question, and think of what roles love and anger should play in your life, and how you deal with the endlessly changing world you are a part of, one that continues struggling to find justice. With that, I now have the pleasure of introducing the 9th president of Bates College, President Gary Jenkins.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here, to be in community with you all on this meaningful day for Bates and for our country. Whether you've walked across campus or you've joined us from across town, it is wonderful to have you here with us. So, as most of you know, and you just heard, it is a Bates tradition to gather each year at this time to honor the life, legacy, and essential work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, we just heard it's 35 years that Bates has been doing this. And these commemorations are made possible only through the hard work of so many, including, first and foremost, the MLK Day Planning Committee, which this year is led by Professor Susan Stark of philosophy. But I also want to thank all of those who designed, proposed a panel or a workshop or a presentation or an event, along with all of you who will take part in these offerings as audiences and participants. So will you please join me in giving our wonderful committee a huge round of applause. So our theme this year is love, anger, and the struggle for justice. And as Angelica said, we are very fortunate to be joined today by a variety of speakers, but I want to specifically call out our keynote speaker, who you'll hear from shortly, author and scholar Myisha Cherry of the University of California at Riverside, who will be more fully introduced in a few moments. But welcome, Professor Cherry. Before we move on, I want to share a few brief thoughts on the day. With a theme like this, it's tempting for me to train my focus on the love component of love, anger, and the struggle for justice. Perhaps, like many in the Bates community, I'm more comfortable with love as a concept, as a practice. I always try to operate from a place of love. Personally, I would much rather spend my days in a space of love rather than a space of anger. But we don't always get to make that choice. And it doesn't have to be a binary. That one approach is right, the other is wrong. It seems to me that part of where our committee is pointing us is linking love and anger with each other and with the notion of the struggle for justice, right? In linking these two, we have to wrestle with how they exist together, how Dr. King talked about this, how they might exist both in tension and in harmony. And this kind of wrestling or reframing is the kind of thing that we are used to doing every day here at Bates, considering multiple ideas, examining how they are contended with, are contradicting, challenging, functioning in concert with one another, the complexity of the duality. In fact, I could easily see love, anger, and the struggle of justice as the title of the class here at Bates. Maybe it has been, maybe it will be. But for today, we will all be enrolled in the same class with the same focus, wrangling difficult questions, working toward understanding together. Dr. King brought the concepts of love, anger, and the struggle of justice together throughout his writings. I think perhaps most memorably in the notion of righteous indignation. As my friend and former colleague, Professor John Powell, who's now at UC Berkeley, has written, King operated from nonviolence, but was not afraid of anger. He called for indignation, but not personal or petite indignation. Instead, he called for righteous indignation. So this concept suggests a feeling based on a sense of hurt, frustration, or outrage about injustice to someone or a group or a class of someone's, perhaps one that someone loves about or cares about, and that is ideally motivating in a quest for justice. It's an anger rooted in love, in a sense of justice, in a sense of what's right, and coupled with the impetus for change. And again, to quote my friend, Professor Powell, sparked by anger, King was calling for a revolution, not with guns or violence, but with spirituality and love. You see, for me, King reminded us that both love and anger can move us to change, to action, to advance justice. So in this, I hear echoes of love, of anger, and the struggle for justice. Above all else, I hear a call for community, for care, for the well-being of others, care for the good of our neighbors as well as ourselves, care for the world around us, care for an investment in community that may be driven by equal parts love and anger, or anger sparked by love, from outrage about the absence of justice, of equity, or by love. love of humankind, love of fairness and justice, something we pressingly need today, tomorrow, in the coming weeks, and beyond. Now look, everything I've said has merely skimmed the surface of a complex notion chosen by our planning committee. Luckily, we have a whole day to go deeper, led by speakers and facilitators and guides, and our keynote speaker, who will be here momentarily to talk with far more depth and insight than I ever could. But I want to thank you all again for being here this morning. I wish you an enriching day of reflection, discussion, and community. I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, once again, the chair of our planning committee, Professor Susan Stark, to introduce our speaker.
Good morning. To students, staff, faculty, community members, President Jenkins, thank you so much for being with us this morning and throughout the day as we continue to address issues of social justice inspired by the life and work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. My name is Susan Stark. I'm a faculty member here at Bates in philosophy, and I have the pleasure of being the current chair of the MLK Day Planning Committee. Knowing that I am the only thing that stands between you and the person you came here to hear, I have 4 brief but important tasks. First, I want to thank some folks. I want to thank the members of the MLK Day Planning Committee: Abdikadir Ahmed, Liana Ameyes, Joyce Bennett, Lucy Britt, Lauren Bisker, Raymond Clothier, Phyllis Graber Jensen, Gwen Lexow, Edalie Lopez, Melanie McGuire, Nate Menefield, Angelica Paniagua, Brenda Pelletier, Melinda Plastis, James Reese, Joanne Roberts, and Christine Schwartz. It is an honor to serve beside this wonderful, dedicated group, many of whom come together year after year to put together an amazing MLK Day. Thank you so much for all the work you've done to create this powerful and wonderful observance this year. I also want to call out and thank Bates Communications Office, who have worked tirelessly in recent weeks and months to help us publicize MLK Day, and often have worked at the very last second with a last-minute request I have made. Please join me in thanking all of these people. Second, I want to acknowledge that Bates College sits on the unceded homelands of the Wabanaki Nations. This place, where we live, study, and work, are the living homelands of the Abenaki, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Micmac, and Maliseet nations. We each have reparative responsibilities because we occupy unceded Wabanaki land. We also have a responsibility to acknowledge that Bates College exists as it does because of the wealth of Benjamin Bates, a Maine business person who derived his wealth from cotton produced by enslaved African and African American people. Third, I want to introduce our theme, as others have touched on it already, but just a few words for the MLK Day 2026 observance. It is love, anger, and the struggle for justice. As we look around our world, our nation, our communities, causes for anger are myriad. Our nation is complicit in genocide in Gaza and is failing to prevent genocides in Sudan and East Turkestan. Our government is targeting and terrorizing our neighbors, both locally and abroad. It is targeting LGBTQ+ people who face increasing repression and terror. We all collectively are causing environmental degradation and climate disaster. Anger is appropriate in the face of these terrible injustices. Yet, we also need love. As Dr. King tells us in his letter from Birmingham jail, we hope that one day the radiant stars of love will shine over our great nation with all their scintillating beauty. But how do we get from anger to the radiant stars of love? Can we, must we embrace anger and love simultaneously in our radical struggle for justice? These questions bring me to my fourth job, to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Myisha Cherry is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Riverside. She is also the director of the Emotion and Society Lab. Her research is primarily concerned with the role of emotions and attitudes in public life. Some of her many books include Unmuted, Conversations on Prejudice, Oppression, and Social Justice. Also, The Case for Rage, Why Anger is Essential to Anti-Racist Struggle. And her latest book is Failures of Forgiveness, What We Get Wrong and How to Do Better. Her influential work on emotions and race, most notably influential among both academics and members of the public, has appeared in The Atlantic, Boston Review, Los Angeles Times, Salon, Huffington Post, Womankind, and New Philosopher magazine. Dr. Cherry is also the host of the Unmute podcast. In an Instagram post a couple of months ago, Dr. Cherry acknowledges that there is a lot to be angry about. Moreover, she acknowledges that some of us may feel as though we are living in the worst possible moment imaginable. But, she cautions, this is not, quote, the first time that the world has felt like this. And every time, somebody just like you kept loving, kept building, kept fighting. They loved when it was dangerous. They built when everything was falling apart. They chose hope, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, unquote. In this same post, Dr. Cherry reminds us that, quote, the light is still here. It is in you. It is in me. It is in us. Every small act of courage, of truth, of love is how we push back. It is how we build something new. Love for self, love for community, love for justice will not be defeated. Today, Dr. Cherry will offer us her wisdom on fear and courage in a talk entitled, What Do We Do with All This Fear? Lessons from Martin Luther King Jr. on Fear and Courage. Please join me in giving the warmest Bates welcome to our 2026 MLK Day keynote speaker, Dr. Myisha Cherry.
I have never heard anyone quote my Instagram, at least in a positive way, so gotta watch what you do online. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Susan, and thank you so much, Bates, for the wonderful hospitality that I have received so far. I am honored and grateful to be with you today to celebrate the legacy and the message and the life of Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm excited to talk about what I have learned from him concerning fear and courage. I'm looking forward to our discussion, hopefully that we'll have time to kind of elaborate the connection between fear, anger, and love. So let's get right into it. So from 1955 to 1968, to Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, he was involved in the civil rights movement. 1955 being the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott in which he led. And this was not simply a time of activism for King, for him to be on the world stage. It was also a time of fear. During this particular time, there was McCarthyism and the Red Scare. There was fear that there were American citizens who were quote unquote enemies within. And so people were scared of being afraid to be accused of being a communist. People were afraid to lose their jobs, lose their reputation. And people were also targeted by America for the first time via the FBI, and King being one of the victims in which the FBI recorded him for primarily most of his activist life. There was also fear that automation was going to take our jobs. Does that sound familiar? During the late 50s, there was a major recession, there was major layoffs, and so people were very concerned about job security. But in this time period, there was also racial terror. This was the era of Jim Crow, and so African Americans were treated as second-class citizens. And to make sure that they stayed in their place, there was the law that was used to keep them in place, whether that was governors, whether that was the police force. And there were also organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan that sought to terrorize African Americans and to make sure they stayed in their proper place. There were lynchings, there were the deaths of African Americans, Emmett Till dying, being murdered a couple of months before the Montgomery bus boycott, with his murderers being acquitted of murder. So this was a massive time of terror for everyone, but particularly African Americans. One of the parishioners of Martin Luther King Jr., in kind of talking about the terror that African Americans felt, she says, quote, "Black children were never intentionally taught fear, but it was there. No Black person in those days could tell you the first time he or she became conscious of his or her fear, but it was always present." Martin Luther King Jr., being an African American, he witnessed this fear in his parishioners and his community. If you're familiar with any of his writings or any of his biographical material, he experienced this fear. But Martin Luther King also thought very intentionally about this fear. He wrote about it, and he also talked about it. So my aim for the time that I have with you today is to kind of clarify King's theoretical understanding of fear. We're going to also kind of explore his practical guidance for responding to fear, particularly within the civil rights movement. And then, because I believe that we're not just here for theory, but we're also here for practice, we're going to also consider how these insights can help us today. So let's talk about fear. Now, one of the first sermons that we know that Martin Luther King preached about fear happened in 1950, called The Conquest of Fear, in which he preached at his father's church in Atlanta. And then there was another sermon that he preached at his church in Montgomery, Alabama, Dexter, in 1957, called The Mastery of Fear. And he will go on, when he was constructing an anthology of his sermons called The Strength to Love, he will edit The Mastery of Fear into what he called The Antidotes for Fear, which was published in 1962 to 1963. If you are familiar with that sermon, Martin Luther King Jr. is not just quoting Jesus, not just quoting the Old Testament, but he's engaged with a variety of thinkers in trying to illuminate the nature of fear as well as the value of fears. So he is talking with and engaging with the Greek tradition of Plato and Aristotle. He's citing Emerson and Thoreau, the pragmatists and the transcendentalists. He's also citing the psychoanalyst Freud, the theologian Paul Tillich, Harry Fosdick, the public minister in New York City, Benjamin Mays, the public thinker and president of Morehouse, as well as New Testament scripture. So he's engaged in a variety of thinkers and really trying to figure out what is fear and what can we do or what should we do about it. Now here's what we discover by that particular sermon. For King, there are several features of fear. For him, unlike anxiety, which doesn't necessarily have a particular object or target, and it can come about without any reason at all, for King, fear has a target. When we are afraid of something. For King, fear is not just a feeling that feels horrible, but it also is a feeling that alarms us to danger. It lets us know that something has gone awry, that there's a threat that is present. He calls it the elemental kind of alarm system. It alarms us to danger. But he also suggests what I consider quite strangely. He says that fear is also a creative force. It's a creative force. So it not only alarms us to danger, but it also motivates us to engage in creative action. So here's how he sets up that argument. He says, quote, "Every great invention and intellectual advance presents a desire to escape some dreaded circumstance or condition." In essence, anything that we've ever created, whether it's these speakers, whether it's this building, people who are afraid to be outside in the cold, has come about because of fear, because we've dreaded our circumstances or our condition. So he says, he continues, quote, "The fear of darkness led to the discovery of the secret of electricity. The fear of pain led to the marvelous advances of medical science. The fear of ignorance was one reason that man built great institutions of learning." So taking these three things together, that has a target, that it alarms us to danger, that is a creative force, for King, he believes that fear facilitates our survival. It allows us to survive. Because life is about threats, fear allows us to survive those threats. And also fear facilitates growth. It doesn't just allow us to be here, but being that it's a creative force, it allows us to create things so that we can flourish. And as a result of that, strangely, King says that fear is necessary. Now here's the thing, not all fear is created equal. In that sermon, he says that there are two types of fear. The first fear he describes as abnormal fears. And for him, this is the problematic fear. This fear makes us vulnerable through paralysis. So as opposed to doing something about our particular dilemma, we become too afraid to do anything at all. This fear also does something to our inner life. For him, it distorts our inner life. One fear that he particularly talks about that is an example of abnormal fear is what he calls fear-hate. And he says that this kind of fear distorts our life because we can become so afraid that we become hateful, so afraid of immigrants that we begin to hate them, so afraid of the unknown that we seek to eliminate it. We can also become so afraid that it makes us coward. And in this way, he's talking to African Americans who was a target of racial terror. He says that their fear can also transform into an abnormal fear, in that, and as opposed to using fear as a creative force, you decide to stay still, don't do anything about your oppression. And in essence, you end up compromising your own self-respect, and this distorts your inner life. But there's another fear. And the fear that he promotes is what he calls normal fear. Normal fear is very different from abnormal fear. Normal fear seeks to protect us. And when we have normal fear, we are motivated to engage in actions in which we're willing to do something to protect ourselves. So instead of paralysis, it's action directed towards protection. But it's not just protection. For him, and this is connected to the creative aspect, normal fear motivates us to improve our well-being. So we can become so afraid of continual injustice that we act, we do something, we unite, we strategize in order to promote justice, to make sure that injustice doesn't come again. An example of this distinction happens in an interview that Coretta Scott King gives in the late 1950s. A few months after the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott, the King's home is firebombed. At the time, Coretta, her 1-year-old daughter Yolanda, and a neighborhood friend is in the home. No one is hurt or injured, but it's no doubt that they know that as a part of fighting against segregation, fighting against Jim Crow, that it may indeed cost them their lives. Years later, she's interviewed by Ebony magazine, and this is what she says about that particular experience. She says, "I had no abnormal fears. My fears were rational. I tried to face up to the reality of the situation, but when I came to the grips with this problem, the possibility of death was considered as being a part of the sacrifice we might have to make for the struggle. I came to feel, as Martin felt, that nothing could stop the cause. So they stayed in Montgomery. These normal fears that this family faced wasn't an example of being in denial about the threat. They were no doubt in denial. They also were not being reckless. Their family would probably disagree during that particular time period. But the fear that they had was a normal fear that motivated them to fight for the cause, to continue to protect their community, and to allow them to be motivated to improve the conditions of Montgomery. So this is what King says at the latter half of that sermon. He says what we should do concerning these two types of fears is that we should master the normal fears and eliminate the abnormal fears. Eliminate, get rid of the fears of people that we have grown to hate. And he believes that the way to eliminate that is through love, by loving others, which he believes is only going to happen through integration, through getting to know each other, being in close proximity to each other. Those are the fears that we should eliminate through love. But there's a other fear that we should embrace. And he calls that normal fears. And the language that he used is master normal fears. Now, I told you that some of the people that he engaged in that particular sermon is the ancient Greek philosophers. And according to Plato, the way that we can interpret King's suggestion in regards to mastering fear is that we can master it like the charioteer masters horses. According to Plato and the Phaedrus, he believes that our emotions can get out of control, and the best way to rein it in, to dominate it, is through reason, putting it under the subjugation of reason. So in some ways, we can interpret King's suggestion to master fear is to dominate it through our rationality. But there's another way to interpret it. We can interpret his master normal fear as mastery. Now, I know this picture is kind of dim, but this is an example of a conductor conducting an orchestra. And the conductor is very different from the charioteer. He doesn't seek to dominate the instruments, to dominate the string section. He wants to guide them so that they are in harmony, so that they can produce something beautiful. So what I'm going to hope to persuade you of is that when King suggests that we master our fears, what he's suggesting is that we should be conductors as opposed to charioteers of our fears. We should be maestros as opposed to mere masters of our normal fears. In other words, we're going to analyze King's work to figure out how we can use fear, not simply to control it, but to create something beautiful. So let's get into it. The first way King suggests, not just in his sermons, the antidotes of fear, but throughout his autobiographies as well as his speeches. The first thing that King suggests is that we should transition that normal fear into courage. According to Aristotle, what it is to be courageous is to have feelings of confidence and to merge those feelings of confidence with fear. So courage is just not doing stuff in spite of your fear. It's taking your fear and matching it up with confidence. Present-day psychological literature adds an additional component. They suggest that action is very important to courage. So it's not just having confidence, it's not just having fear, but it's also engaging in action, which they define as a willful, intentional act executed after mindful deliberation. In other words, the components of courage is us taking our normal fear, matching it up with confidence, and matching it up with action. And the combination of mixing those things together would allow us to create something beautiful in the world. So what do I mean by confidence? 3 things. The first kind of theory of what kind of confidence is involved in courage is what philosophers refer to as colonic confidence, colonic meaning noble. And they say that this is a kind of confidence that you have courage. And you have courage, part of having courage is being confident that the fight that you are involved in is that you're fighting for a beautiful or noble cause. That gives you confidence and thus courage. And when you look at King's life and his speeches, there's no doubt that he had this kind of confidence and sought to impart it in his audience. In an interview, he's asked, "Are you afraid?" And he responds in this particular interview, he says, "No, I'm not afraid." I interpret that, "No, I don't have abnormal fears." He says, "This is a great issue that we are confronted with. And the consequences for my personal life are not particularly important." He realizes that the cause that he's involved in is a beautiful cause, is a noble cause, and is worth the risk. In the speech, I see the Promised Land, delivered in 1968, the very end of his life. He says, "I just want to do God's will." He believed that the fight for civil rights wasn't just about fighting for injustice. It was about fulfilling God's mission and God's call over his life. And he says that we as a people will get to the Promised Land. "I am happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man," end quote. Why not? Because he was confident in his mission. The organization that he will become president of, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, had as their motto this kind of confidence in a noble cause. And their motto was to redeem the soul of America. And it was this confidence that was part of their courage. But there was another kind of confidence that's embedded in courage. And I kind of call this a higher confidence in certain kind of theological circles. They call it kind of an eschatological confidence. And this is a confidence that the universe or a higher power, or one might even say morality, is on your side. And because it is on your side, that force, that moral force, that spiritual force will help you gain victory. I don't think King could have done anything that he did if he didn't have this higher confidence. He says in the speech, Remain and Await, quote, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice," believing that they were fighting in accordance to a universal kind of principle, a universal kind of predestination, as you might say. In the same speech, he says, "We are going to win," this confidence, "our freedom." Why? Because both the sacred heritage of our nation, so this tradition of equality and injustice, the principles, the founding principles of this nation, as well as the eternal will of the Almighty God, both these things together, he believes, are embodied in the demands. And that's why he believes that he's going to win. They're going to win this victory. But there's also a third confidence as I look through the speeches, particularly latter speeches, and as well as the early interviews of King, is that there was another confidence that was built into the courage that he preached. And this was a self-confidence. Last night, we had the opportunity to kind of talk about human dignity. And part of the self-confidence is that he believed that it was important to understand that you had dignity. And because of that dignity, because of that kind of esteem, that you were deserving of your rights, right? That confidence that you are deserving was what was part of his courage. He writes in the speech, Been to the Mountaintop, quote, "We are saying that we are determined to be men, to be people. We are saying that we are God's children and that we don't have to live like we are forced to live." This is self-confidence. He says, quote, in a very early interview in his life in 1957, "The new Negro is a person with a new sense of dignity." And he's contrasting this with the African Americans who were so subsumed by fear. He says, "But there's a new Negro on the scene who is a person with a new sense of dignity and destiny, with a new self-respect." And he says this willingness, this new Negro, has a willingness to stand up courageously, as if without this new sense of dignity, they would not have the courage to stand up. But because they have it, they now stand up courageously and is willing to fight for what he deserves. And it is this self-confidence that was embodied in his principle of somebodyness. The author Paul Allen defines this principle as a recapture of a sense of dignity. And the recapture is important here, because once you go through oppression, particularly kind of the history of being enslaved, being a victim of Jim Crow, it's easy to lose one's own sense of dignity. When the situations that you are set up to live doesn't reflect dignity, when you're not treated with a sense of respect, not treated as an individual, it's easy to kind of lose that sense of dignity. But his sense of somebodyness that he's preaching in the 50s and the 60s, he says, African Americans now, they have recaptured this sense. And so sense of somebodyness is a recapture of the sense of dignity in spite of perpetuated anti-Black racial injustice. So it's not as if the injustice has ended. It's not as if the inequity and the dehumanization has ended, but one still has a sense of dignity despite the dehumanization. So he writes to a group of students, and so every Black person in this country must rise up and say, I am somebody. I have a rich, proud, and noble history. I am Black, but I am Black and beautiful. And this is not merely motivational Instagram memes for the sake of likes or motivation for them to feel good. King recognized that it was important, for one, for them to fight against white supremacy by recapturing a sense of dignity. But it was also important for them to understand who they were and to have confidence in themselves so they continue to fight and have courage for the cause. And last but not least, the kind of third feature to this courage is action. For King, action was about nonviolent militant resistance. This was exemplified in marches, and boycotts, and sit-ins, and voting, and demonstrations. And, I think it's very important for us to kind of consult the archive to kind of regain a kind of admiration for these particular actions, that they truly took courage, right? A lot of times in which they marched, they did not have, injunctions to march, and so they were marching illegally. And as a result of that, they faced brutality by the police, which we'll talk a little bit more later. They boycotted businesses. They tried to engage in sit-ins, and if you're familiar with the student sit-in of SNCC, they were also brutalized and physically assaulted for doing so. They were voting demonstrations, and not only were they physically assaulted and could lose their jobs for engaging in the voting demonstrations, but people were also killed for wanting to gain the right to vote. So there was a lot of risks, but because actions was a part of courage, this is something that they engaged in. So action was very important to King. The opposite of courage for King was something that he called do-nothingism. And do-nothingism was an example of inaction. And so if you're familiar with King's sermon, you'll notice that he's very much against acquiescing to oppression, right? He believed that not doing anything about oppression was acquiescing to injustice. It was a way of escaping one's duty, escaping action. For him, it was about resigning from the struggle. And he believed that acquiescing, escaping, and resigning wasn't just inaction, it was cooperating with evil. So he was tremendously against it. And King personally, in his own life, he refused to subscribe to do-nothingism. There was a situation in February 21st, 1956, right after the Montgomery bus boycott. The city indicted a lot of the protesters. Rosa Parks was one of those individuals, as well as King. At the time, King was traveling, and he decided to go to Atlanta to join his family. And his father was very concerned about him returning back to Montgomery, all right? Now, you might think, oh, what's the big deal? Just go ahead, face the indictment. Of course, he's going to get cleared. Nothing's going to happen. But we do know that when Black men, Black protesters were arrested, they could have gotten lynched. There was no guarantee that he was going to make it home. And so there was great risk of physical danger. And his father kind of staged an intervention for him not to get on the plane, right? He tried to convince him. He even got Benjamin Mays to convince him. But King stood up to these people that he admired. And this is what Jonathan Egg writes in his book. He says, Daddy King, afraid for his son's life, urged his son to remain in Atlanta. He convened a meeting of friends, including Benjamin Mays, to make the case. And this is what 20-something young Martin Luther King said to these men. He stood up to them and he said, "It would be the height of cowardice for me to stay away. I would rather be in jail for 10 years than to desert my people." All right? This is courage. This is courageous action. He refused to run away. He refused to resign from the cause, got back on a plane, and decided to courageously to get indicted. This is the famous photo of that mugshot, 7089. Thank goodness nothing happened to King, and he was able to get released. So not only do we see this objection to do nothingness in his old life, he also preached against it. He writes, quote, "There are soft-minded individuals among us who feel that the only way to deal with oppression is to adjust to it. They acquiesce to the fate of segregation." But King says this is not the way out. Soft-minded acquiescence is cowardly, because to be courageous, we have to do something. So King reminds us to take our normal fears, match it up with confidence, and match it up with action. And then once we do that, we need to act urgently. We need to move with action. Now, when it comes to fear, fear doesn't just require action. It requires, oftentimes, immediate action. A lot of you all have experienced this. You're driving, you're about to get into a car accident, your heart is beeping, you're sweaty, and you immediately hit the brakes, right? So your fear kind of motivates you not just to respond, but to quickly respond. So fear often requires immediate action. Our fright responses are oftentimes very time sensitive. If you see a bear, they say don't run, but I'm gonna run very, very quickly. Right? Fright responses are very, very time sensitive. A delay can get you. So even the typical kind of fear responses that they say in psychology, whether that's fighting, whether that's flighting, running away, or whether that's freezing, it's important that you do it quickly in order to survive. And I believe that this also applies to justice. So you shouldn't just hit that brake quickly, shouldn't just run from that bear quickly, but you should also engage in fighting against injustice urgently, quickly, do it now. King sought to inspire urgency. And in order to do so, one of the things that he urged his followers to do is to create a new relationship with time. During his lifetime, there's what he called kind of the myth of time, and the myth of time simply says, in time, racial justice will be granted, all right? We just need to wait it out. In time, things are gonna get better. But for King, he believed that time was neutral. Time doesn't do anything for us. It's not good or bad. We make it good, we make it bad, we make use of it. So progress doesn't just happen in time. How does it happen? It happens only through us engaging in urgent and persistent action. Is time able to do what it needs to do? So therefore, for King, he believed that our actions needed to be urgent. For King, we help time along through our urgent actions. And so for him, we help time by first understanding, and this is what he says in his sermon, Remaining Awake, that the time is always right to do now, right? So if you're wondering, okay, so when should I help this particular person? When should I engage in this particular movement? When should I write this particular email? When should I join this organization? For King, now. That's how we help time along. In a speech delivered to some young activists at Calvary Baptist Church, he says, the Negro wants his freedom not tomorrow, when we feel a little bit more energetic, not next week when it'll make people a little bit more comfortable. He says the Negro wants his freedom now. He wants his freedom now. Now is always the time for justice. He says in an NAACP speech, as a result of the need for urgencies, he says, there is no time to pause or to be complacent. We gotta act now. He also sought to inspire urgency by challenging a false perception that he believed was going around in his particular era. In the speech, Remaining Awake, he defines that false perception as people suggesting that African Americans just moving too fast, change is happening too fast. He says, quote, charges that Negroes are going too fast, for him, it's not just false, but it's cruel, right? When you consider the hundreds of years that African Americans have been treated as second-class citizens, and then to suggest that they're moving too fast is just cruel. It's insensitive to their struggle and to the realities of the times. And he also suggests that it's dangerous. And then he says, the Negro is not even going fast enough. He was a man of urgency. He also sought to inspire urgency by tackling what he calls the wait strategy. So he believed not only was there kind of a rumor in the air or a misconception in the air that African Americans were moving too fast, but there were also this idea that, hey, you just need to wait it out. Right? If you wait it out, white folks in the South will be a little bit more sensitive. If you just wait it out, they'll be a little bit more accommodating. And if you don't wait, you're going to create more problems than you can solve. But King saw beneath this particular strategy. For him, the call to wait always just meant never. He says, I would think that it would be much better in the long run to stand up and to be aggressive. With this aggressive attitude, I believe that we will bring the gains of civil rights much sooner than we would just by idly standing by, waiting for things to be given voluntarily. And if you're familiar with King's speech to a letter from a Birmingham jail, he simply says that nothing is ever given, particularly justice, is ever given. You must take it by force, right? And you can't idly stand by. You must demand it. You must take it now. King also inspired urgency and urgent action, but not settling or refusing to settle in for delays. So he writes in the letter from Birmingham jail, he says, we must come to see that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have made it more than 340 years for our Constitution and God-given rights, and we must continually, courageously, continue to challenge the system of segregation. We must make it patently clear that we cannot settle for all the delaying tactics and all the gradualism that has engulfed our soft land. The time is now. So King suggests for us that we ought to use our fear to engage in action, but not just any action, in urgent action, and being careful that we resist procrastination, that we resist waiting, that we resist delaying, that we act now. Another thing that King believes that we should do with our fear to make it beautiful and to create beautiful things. It is strategize and to organize. Aristotle says in his work, The Rhetoric, that one of the things that fear does is it sets us thinking what can be done, right? When you're fearful about something, you're trying to find solutions, right? How can I fix this? What do I need to do to get out of this? Fear sets us thinking what can be done. So it kind of activates our rationality, right? So the psychology suggests that what fear does, it makes us very sharp and it makes us very focused. If you were to interview any Winter Olympians, which a lot of folks have done, and it's a famous article where an interviewer is asking them, what does fear do for you? It talks about how, although they're skiing in very risky environments in which they can hurt themselves, it's the fear that makes them focus and alert, right? And that doesn't just happen in sports. I want to suggest that it also happens in other aspects of our life. If you can remember, I've said earlier that fear has a creative force, and for King, it's out of fear that we create these wonderful inventions and institutions. And I think the explanation of fear making us sharp and making us focus, it not being against rationality, but can aid our rationality, kind of helps us understand why it is the case that we can invent and create things because of fear. And it's because of this focus and this sharpness and clarity that fear gives to us. Now, you might ask, why strategize? Why strategize with normal fear? Well, we go back to the example of abnormal fear, which for King is fear-hate, fear hate that is embodied in white terrorism. When we think about particularly the white terrorism that King and many people face in the mid-20th century, white terrorism is, it has goals, #goals, right? The intentionality of bombing King's home was to deter him from engaging in the civil rights movement, right? The purpose of bombing churches was to prevent African Americans from organizing, because that's where they organize their marches and they strategize. So it was to destroy the places that they planned. All right, so very goal-directed. They had a goal. White terrorism has a goal. It was also very well planned, and it was also very organized. The Citizens Council was an organization. The Ku Klux Klan was an organization. So white terrorism is often very goal-directed, well-planned, and organized. And if that's the case, King believed that the civil rights movement should just be as organized and as strategic. That if white terrorism is using fear, hate to plan, to organize, to accomplish goals, then there's no doubt that African Americans, with their courage, should also use that fear to strategize and organize. As I said before, the strategy for King, influenced by Gandhi, was nonviolent militant resistance. And as we look over King's life, the way that we see this kind of strategy and organizing live, we see it in a lot of the organizing and the campaigns that King engaged in. So with courage, we see that community in Montgomery, Alabama, organized the Montgomery bus boycott, in which King was a spokesman and a leader. And if you're familiar with the context, we know that before the bus boycott, African Americans faced humiliation on buses. So not only did they have to sit at the back, they paid at the front and then walked out as not to disturb white folks to enter from the back. They had to give up their seat. If they did not give up their seat, the driver had legal authority to kick them out. They often carried guns. A lot of people who protested to refuse to move were beaten and assaulted, right? And so what these individuals did was they decided to put their courage in action. And they thought to themselves, we're tired of facing these indignities in the bus. We're fearful every time we get on the bus. But this fear led them to think, what can be done? So they organized and decided to boycott the buses. And it wasn't just, we're not going to ride the buses. It was very organized. They still had to figure out how to get to work. And so there's strategies around how that happened. So they discussed and planned how people can stay off the bus. They also created a list of demands. This is organizing. This is strategy. And as a result of that, in this, they also end up creating an organization in which they led this boycott, which is the Montgomery Improvement Association. Organized, strategized with their fear. With courage, they didn't just stop there. They organized even after the violent backlash of their previous organizing. So one of the things we know, what a lot of people are not familiar with, a lot of people celebrate the victory of the bus boycott, but they don't know that just a few days later, after it happens for a year, the federal government ends up desegregation on buses, but there's immediately a backlash. That night, the KKK rode around neighborhoods in Montgomery. A shotgun was fired in MLK's home. No one was hurt. White men beat a 15-year-old black girl on the street. Snipers fired at the city buses. And let me tell you what these courageous black folks did. They said, we're going to create another organization called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And we're going to create this organization to duplicate the successes of Montgomery. All right? So as opposed to allowing their fear of what was happening, given the backlash, they set about, what can we do? What more can we do to bring about justice? With courage, they also strategized to bring attention to voting rights in Selma. We know that what was happening in Selma, African Americans was being turned away to register to vote. And if they were caught voting, they could be let go of their job. Physical violence could occur. Some were arrested or killed for protesting or demonstrating their right to vote. So what did these courageous black folks do? They organized marches, and the aim of these marches was to dramatize the moral issue and arouse the federal government to come in and to make sure that Black folks could vote in the South. This organizing that a lot of us are perhaps familiar with was taking place over several days. They decided to take a march from Selma to Montgomery. And we know on the third walk, on March 7, 1965, which became known as Bloody Sunday, they faced opposition by the police who refused to allow them to march. It got quite violent, and this violence was witnessed in newspapers and on television. And in response to this, President Johnson ended up making a speech that made Martin Luther King Jr. cry. This is some excerpts from the speech. He says, quote, "Long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. Many were brutally assaulted. One man, a man of God, was killed." But he says the real hero of this struggle is the American Negro. His actions and protests, his courage to risk his safety and even to risk his life have awakened the conscience of the nation. Remember, the strategy was to dramatize the issue, right? So their actions, their courageous actions, was able to achieve the goal that they wanted. He continues, "And who among us can say that we would have made the same progress were it not for his persistent bravery and his faith in American democracy?" And as a result of that organizing and that strategizing, the Voting Rights Act was able to get enough support to be passed in 1965. Another thing that we should do with our fear transitions into courage is to focus on thriving. Now, we know that there are certain modes that we can be in life. We can be in survival mode, or we can be in thriving mode. Fear in survival mode, at best, it can get us the same old, same old. If you are in survival mode, your main objective is just to live to see another day. It's just to survive it. So if you're using your fear and your whole goal is just to survive, at best, you're going to be able to do just that. But at worst for King, because this was going to transfer into abnormal fear, it can lead you to compromise because you just want this when you should be getting this. You might compromise what you actually need. Courage in thriving mode is quite different from fear in survival mode. That when you are in thriving mode, when you don't just want to survive, but you have high expectations for your justice aims, at best, you're going to get what you deserve to flourish. And at worst, even if you don't get that, your integrity will be left in place. Your standards will be left intact. And so for King, he instructed his followers to be in thriving mode, and he believed being in thriving mode will inform their goals, their justice goals. And it's for this reason, if you look at kind of the goals that King had for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and just his activism life in general, desegregation was cool as a goal, right? But he had a higher goal. He just didn't want African Americans to survive Jim Crow. He wanted them to thrive. He wanted them to have first-class citizenship. So he wanted integration. He argued for integration. So it wasn't just enough for there to be laws in which, different races were forced to be a part. But he wanted integration. He wanted people to truly live among each other, not just in proximity, but also in their hearts. He had a higher goal. This is a thriving goal. He wasn't just fighting for new laws, new civil rights acts, voting rights acts, but he felt that it was necessary not just to have laws on the table, but for government powers to enforce those laws. Because he wasn't just in survival mode, he was in thriving mode. He didn't just want to destroy segregation, right? He wanted to destroy everything that made it the case or that prevented people from flourishing in their lives. So he wanted to destroy poverty. So later in his life, he gets involved in the Poor People's Campaign. He wanted to destroy war, and that's why he spoke out against Vietnam. And he had these particular goals because Martin Luther King was interested in thriving. When you're in thriving mode, it not only informs your goals, but it's going to inform what you expect and what you accept. He writes in an early interview, he says, a more enduring myth is that the Negro has waited so long that any improvement will satisfy him. Right? This is survival mode, and that's a myth. He says the Negroes would not be deluded into accepting token over sincere beginnings. He wanted sincere beginnings, he wanted full flourishing, full growth, and for him, he was not just going to be satisfied with any old thing, right? He wanted to be a full citizen. He says, there are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? King says, we cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. That's survival. As long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. King was in thriving mode. And it's because he was in thriving mode that he refused to settle for partial victories. The situation while in Selma, they were planning a march, and at the time, King was in jail. And the district judge decides to make a few provisions, kind of satisfying a few of the demands that the movement had. And as a result of the judge satisfying a few of these demands, the leaders in King's absence decide to call off the scheduled protests that they had for that day. King heard about this, and he was upset. And this is what he said to them. He says, please don't be too soft. We have the offensive. It was a mistake not to march today. In a crisis, we must have a sense of drama. We may accept the restraining order as a partial victory, but we cannot stop. Why? Because a partial victory is not a whole victory. We gotta keep moving. So for King, we gotta strategize, we gotta organize, and we're doing it all to thrive as opposed to survive. And last but not least, in order to make fear beautiful, for King, we have to stay in courage. Now, when you're fighting against any kind of injustice, there's going to be obstacles. There's going to be setbacks. There's going to be backlash. This is a picture of King. A lot of people like to show pictures of King reigning victorious in Montgomery, being on the bus, celebrating the fact that they can now ride an integrated bus. But there were a lot of quote-unquote failures that a lot of people don't pay attention to. There were failures in Albany. Some people might even call his work that he did in Chicago a failure. This is a picture from a time that he went to Mississippi in order to fight for or fight against Jim Crow there. And he faced major opposition, and you can see that he's being physically assaulted there. So you're going to face obstacles, you're going to face backlash, you're going to face physical assault. And the question is, how do you keep the courage that we've just got finished talking about? These obstacles can make your fear turn from normal to abnormal. Right? It's easy for King to have this particular experience that he begins to have a kind of a fear-hate towards these people that are beating him. Right? Very vulnerable time. During these particular times, it's easy for your confidence to decrease. It's easy for you to wonder if doing anything has a point. And so staying in courage, right? Keeping your courage through certain kind of actions, certain kind of entities is very, very important. So how did King and the movement stay encouraged? Well, we like to talk about the public life of King, but the private life of King, he had a good support system. When he first started, a school friend sent him a letter and told him, do not back down, do not swerve, keep the courage, keep the patience, the task must be met head on. So he had people in his life that encouraged him. In the Antidotes of Fear, he talks about an encounter that he has with an older member of his church. And that encounter encouraged him. He says, "Something is wrong with you," she says. "You didn't talk strong tonight." This is after a speech that he's recalling. Seeking further to disguise my fears, he's explaining, he responded to the older lady. He says, "Oh no, Mother Pollard, nothing is wrong. I'm feeling as fine as ever." And then she responds, "No, you can't fool me. I know something is wrong." And then she says in her dialect, "I done told you that we is with you all the way. But even if we ain't with you, God's going to take care of you." And then King says, as a result of this exchange of encouragement, he says, "As she spoke these consoling words, everything in me quivered and quickened with a pulsing tremor of raw energy." Her words that she was able to speak to him was enough for him to regain his energy, regain his courage to continue the fight. He was also able to keep other people encouraged through his speeches. One of the things that we know is that before they even engage in any kind of action, they met in churches and they were speeches delivered before the demonstration as well as after the demonstration. And these are not just rhetorical kind of aesthetics, but these were means to keep the people encouraged as they engage in their particular actions. Witnessing this on the receiving end, John Lewis, as an early member of the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, after kind of going to a few of King's speeches, talked to an interviewer later on in his life. He says, as a result of experiencing his speeches, he says, "We believed in Martin Luther King Jr. He taught us to stand up, to be bold, to be brave." And he exemplified it in his life, but he also spoke it and preached about it in his sermons. It wasn't just motivational speeches before marches that he used to encourage people. He also encouraged people through eulogy. In the speech eulogy for the martyred children as a result of the 4 girls who were murdered in Alabama, he says to that audience that is grieving, that perhaps also feels discouraged to fight, given that the church was bombed as a result of backlash. He says to his audience, so they have something to say to us in their death. They say to each of us, not to go away, not to be afraid. Black and white, he says, they say to us that we must substitute courage for caution. Their death says to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly to make the American dream a reality. So even in grieving moments, he uses a moment to keep them encouraged. And then last but not least, King and the movement used song to keep the people encouraged. We know that before the marches, while they were marching, activists sung Negro spirituals, they sung folk songs, they sung gospel songs. And it was the language, the motivational words embodied in these spirituals that motivated them. And this is what King says as a result of the experience of singing the songs. He says, the freedom songs are playing a strong and vital role in our struggle. They give the people a new courage and a sense of unity. I think they keep alive a faith, a radiant hope in the future, particularly in our most trying hours. Right? So they use these songs to encourage them. So it wasn't just so it won't be silent, it wasn't just background noises, but as a way for them to stay encouraged. He continues in talking about the power of these songs. He says, I have stood in the medium of hundreds of youngsters and joined in while they sang, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. And he says, it's not just a song, it's a resolve. A few minutes later, I've seen those same youngsters refuse to turn around from the onrush of police dogs, suggesting that the songs that they sung was enough to give them the courage to persevere through the attacks that they experienced during the demonstrations. He says, I saw them refuse to turn around before a Bull Connor in command of men armed with power hoses. These songs bind us together. They give us courage, and they help us march together. So psychology research backs up King's claims that singing in unison with a group of people can not only give us courage, but it also elevates our mood. So if we're feeling depressed or feeling discouraged or feeling sad, singing with people can make us feel happy, can give us a sense of hope. We know that singing together in particular, releases chemicals in our brains with other people who are singing, and this can build, oxytocin can build a sense of trust that is also needed as you continue to organize and fight with the people that you're singing with. And I think most importantly, what singing with a group does, it makes them feel that they are not alone. And this is very important with staying encouraged. So in conclusion, when I look at King's life and work, it's easy to say that for King, the fear that we feel as we face the forces of injustice, that we ought to just try to get rid of it, eliminate it. But you can't be courageous without having some fear. And what King teaches us, the problem is not fear. The problem is abnormal fear, but there's a fear that we can have, which is normal fear. And what we should do with this fear is to make something beautiful out of it. I don't know about you, but 2026, we're still in January, right? Is a time for fear for lots of us. And I've been thinking about, a part of me, in writing about anger, I thought that I was just so radical, and I experienced all the strong emotions. But in the last few months, I have had to reckon with this sense of fear that I feel. And turning to King has been illuminating. And I've learned that fear doesn't mean that we are weak. It doesn't mean that we're giving people the upper hand. It means that we're sensitive to injustice. It means that we value the people that we're fearful for. And we value the principles that we are scared that we're going to lose. And King reminds me, and I hope that he reminds you, that as we continue to face this trying year and the years to come, that we should use this fear to be courageous, partner it up with confidence, that there are people who are loud, and there are people who may have power. But as long as we have confidence that we are fighting for noble ends, that we're fighting for is beautiful, that we have justice and the universe on our side, and we're engaging in urgent action, that we're strategizing together as opposed to allowing things to separate us. We're unified, we're organizing, we're aiming to thrive as opposed to just survive it all and to hide. And we're encouraging each other as we go about. I think as long as we continue to embody these things, we can thrive and reach the mountaintop. Thank you. Thank you. So we have 7 minutes, I believe. I'm not a timekeeper, but I would love to engage in some questions, if anyone have any questions. Not thought statements, but questions about fear, about how this connects with love and anger. Go ahead and raise your hand. I don't know how this is. I'm just doing this. I don't know how I should do this, but I see a hand, so go ahead and stand up and project. I think there's a mic that's going to be passed around. The mic is there? Okay.
So I've always felt like the idea that the arc bends towards the moral universe is a defeatist sentiment. And it's kind of interesting that you brought up the idea of like King being totally against that. And I'm wondering, how do you square those two things? Because when you say that justice always prevails, the good will always happen, that seems like that forces people to wait, you know?
Yeah. So I think for King, and I think a lot of kind of liberation theologians of his time, believes that it takes two, right? That two things can be true at the same time, that the arc of the universe is, that you can't have justice without us, literally, but you can't have justice without us fighting for justice. But it's also good to know that the universe is open to allowing this to happen. So much so that when you think that your actions are not working out, you can at least have this faith that the universe is open to collaborating with you to making this happen. And I think it's the collaboration that is important to King. So what he's relying on is he's simply suggesting the universe is calling forth for you to do something. And it can only do what it needs to do with your assistance. And when you get weary, it's good to know that the universe is there. And when you get lazy, it's good to know that you need to do something. So I think with King, he's trying to square both of those notions together. There's a lot of people who, have disagreements about the arc of the universe. And there's no doubt, one might ask, did King really believe that? Because when you think about, as I just laid out, you got the success of Montgomery, Albany, bad, Selma. And so I think a question that we need to ask is exactly what does that mean? Does it mean that progress is really going to go like this, right? That every battle that you have is going to end in a victory and everything is going to be smooth and we're only going up? Or does it mean ultimately that despite the ups and downs, that there are certain kind of principles that's going to work in your favor if you just keep working? And I think King is trying to square those two realities together. I think that progress ebbs and flows. But I also think that there are principles. And it just has to be, this is faith here, a triumph of good over evil. But that triumph is not going to happen without my participation. And I'm not motivated to participate unless I know that evil is not going to have the last word. So I think the two goes together. Y'all, we only got 7 minutes. Yes.
Um, 60 years ago was the Voting Rights Act, and I was a little upset regarding Texas, who someone said to find them 5 extra seats, and it's gone back to before the Voting Rights Act because a person of color is not a whole person anymore.
It goes back to the point that I made earlier about progress ebbing and flowing. And I think if King was here, I would ask the question, what exactly did you see on the mountaintop? Because I doubted that he saw a heaven, all right? Because a heaven suggests that we got there, it's a utopia, we finally arrived, there's no more struggle, there's no more evil. But King, being the personalist theologian that he was, he knew that there was 2 parts to us. There's a good part, there's an evil part. And if the evil is still there within us, we may have a success, voting rights, in one era. But there's no guarantee because of the evil and the inclinations, the selfishness, the isms that's in us, that that's going to stay there, right? And that's why I think he never stopped celebrating after the Montgomery success. Because for him, I just felt that he thought that freedom was a constant struggle. So there's a lot that we can accomplish, there's a lot of thriving that we can have, but it's a constant struggle. So there's no doubt that we were able to get the Voting Rights Act in 1965. But as we know, there's still barriers being set up, gerrymandering, redlining, all that stuff that's happening. But it's just good to be reminded it's a constant struggle. And if freedom is a constant struggle, that simply suggests that there's no time, this is King here, there's no time to relax, there's no time to wait, to be patient. That we also have to be constantly struggling. And I know that doesn't sound sexy. But if we want beautiful things, we got to continue to fight, to create, and to preserve beautiful things. And that requires constant effort.
Hello, I'm James Reese, and I'll be very brief. First, the words and presentation I know are felt with great feeling this morning, as you have exhibited, and especially to me as a person who was born in Selma in 1955 and has relived all the bravery and courage of the bravest people I've ever known. So let's all give one more round of applause to Dr. Myisha Cherry. In the Commons Fireplace Lounge, across the next hour towards noon, Dr. Cherry will be there to be greeted and a book signing. And second and lastly, for me to you, today we have the workshops coming up in just a few minutes and 3 sessions across the afternoon, the MLK debate this afternoon in Olin, and 7:30 p.m. the evening program in Olin Concert Hall featuring student talent, including the Bates Manders. You can find the schedule online on the Bates website for all of today's activities. And finally, yes, another guest workshop presenter is Bill Jeter, class of '76, and a brilliant artist. He greeted me on Saturday by saying he was thrilled to be back on campus with the Bates World Changers. With that, I encourage you to enjoy the day and to make efforts now and into the future to continue to get to know each other and continue to be world changers with urgency and courage. Thank you very much.